So I started learning Chinese a few months ago, and after a while of doing that, I realized that I had made a very big mistake in my strategy, my learning strategy. And today I'd like to share with you the mistake so that you don't make the same thing. So before I started learning Chinese, I had heard that learning the characters was a very challenging, very difficult part of the whole learning process, right? So because of the fact that A, you have so many characters to learn, and B, you have to start with a new language from scratch, a new language which, by the way, is extremely difficult, then what I had read is that many people struggle a lot to just get started with Chinese. Like, they try to learn the characters and they try to learn like the grammar and to understand how the language works and to learn the first few words. Like, because of that, they would spend 1 year and they would still have an extremely basic level of Chinese. Like, that's what I had read. So I thought to myself, that makes a lot of sense, but I don't want to go through that same situation, right? How can I avoid it? How can I just get started and get a decent, very basic, but at least a decent basic level of Chinese, which can help me communicate with others without the burden of learning so many characters and getting distracted by the characters. And well, the idea I came up with was, let's just ignore the characters, right? Let's just completely ignore them. Let's just try to learn Chinese without learning the characters whatsoever, just by relying on Pinyin, which is this sort of westernized alphabet of the Chinese characters, like the translation of the characters to our alphabet with some accents telling you what the tones are. So I was like, let's just ignore characters completely. Let's just focus on Pinyin and base my reading on that. And although I think that my initial idea was good and was well oriented, by the end of the day, I don't think it was a very smart decision. So today I'm going to explain why I think that was the case and what I think I could have done instead. So why do I think it was a bad idea? Well, firstly, because all of the content done in Chinese, like most of it, let's say 90%, is done using the Chinese characters, right? They are using their own writing systems. They are not producing that content using Pinyin. Pinyin is mostly used in materials that are targeting people who are learning Chinese, right? So let's say study books, or let's say videos done for people who are learning Chinese. But after some point, you are only going to come across materials that do not use Pinyin whatsoever and that only use Chinese characters. And the thing is, this point in time would come sooner rather than later to me. So what happened was that after just a few months of learning Chinese, like I think 3 or 4, the teacher or the materials that we encountered in the book, which was like an HSK 3 book, they suddenly just used Chinese characters and stopped using Pinyin whatsoever. And the thing is, this situation was only going to get worse for me, because from that point onwards, I was going to be able to find less and less materials with Pinyin, and thus the materials I was going to encounter were only going to have Chinese characters. And this is something I was going to encounter like with the reading materials, but also, let's say I decided to watch a movie in Chinese. The movie is most likely not going to have any sort of Pinyin translation, right? So the situation I'm describing you is one where you are listening to something in a target language, which is very difficult for you. So you're struggling to understand what they're saying, and you want to base yourself on what you're seeing like written on the screen in order to understand it, but you don't understand what's written on the screen, right? So thus you're gonna lose out on so many learning possibilities, right? Because you don't understand what's being written. And this is actually very problematic, and it's something that started showing up sooner than expected in my case. Okay, so the second reason why I believe it was a bad idea to take that approach was that I was actually going to become an illiterate in Chinese. Like, I was not going to be able to neither read or write. And I remember that I actually thought about this, obviously, when I was making the decision, but I thought, it doesn't matter. I'll just translate the Chinese characters to Pinyin, whenever I encounter like Chinese characters. Let's say I'm on the street, let's say I happen to visit China and I'm on the streets and I see something and I want to understand what it is, and I just like take a picture of it with this tool you have on Google Translate or something like that, and then it tells you like the translation on top of that, but it also tells you like the Pinyin meaning and the Pinyin translation. But the thing is, like, it would be very uncomfortable to live like that if you visit a Chinese speaking country. So I can imagine that I would go to a restaurant and they get the menu, and I would actually probably know some of the words written in the menu because I have some knowledge of Chinese. But given that I cannot read, then I would have to constantly like take pictures and constantly rely on the phone to give me the translation to Pinyin, which is sort of similar to not being able to understand the language, right? Because I wouldn't really have been able to understand the characters, the actual Chinese language, without the help of the phone. So yeah, although I don't live in China or in a Chinese speaking country, and although I don't have any intention of going and settling there, I still think it's like a very dumb situation, right? So let's say I managed to get my Chinese to a relatively decent level in terms of speaking, but then not being able to read whatsoever, then that would be quite an absurd situation to say, to be in a Chinese speaking country, to be able to sort of speak the language in a way or to say some basic things, but then not to be able to read anything. Like in that situation, I would be able to say, I speak the language, but I cannot read it, which would be a completely absurd situation and would be sort of an incomplete learning of the language, right? Because if you can speak it, but if you can't actually read the characters, then I wouldn't be able to say confidently like I know Chinese or I speak Chinese. Like, I would be able to say I speak Chinese, but then I wouldn't be able to read or write it. I don't know, it's just a situation that seems a little bit deplorable. And the final reason why I believe it was a mistake is that I've now realized that it's not that difficult to learn the Chinese characters. Like, yes, it is something challenging, but it is not this super daunting task that is hardly impossible to do and whatsoever. No, what I've come to realize after starting to learn the Chinese characters is that it is not such a big deal. You just have to be consistent and try to read in the Chinese characters, with the Chinese characters. Like, you have to make the effort to leave aside Pinyin and to actually try to decipher the Chinese characters. And once you start doing this every day, whenever you practice Chinese, once you start relying less and less on Pinyin and you start forcing yourself to go through the characters, then it starts to become intelligible. Like bit by bit, I can feel that I learn more and more characters by just making the effort every day of just going through the characters a little bit and doing a little bit every day. I mean, I still know a very small amount of characters, but I was sort of surprised of how quickly I started learning more and more characters. Like by going through them over and over again, they just start sticking. So yeah, to sum up, I believe that my initial idea of trying to focus less on the characters and more on getting to speak some words and on learning the words and not learning the characters was a good one. However, completely ignoring the characters and focusing 100% on just speaking and learning new words was not a good idea. So if instead of doing that, I had just focused on the characters every now and then, like if I had done a little bit once every 2 or 3 days, then I wouldn't have gotten to the point where I could already speak a little bit and understand a few words, but was not able to read anything whatsoever. Like the level of my understanding of the Chinese characters and the level of my, let's say, speaking skills would have been more or less the same, or at least there wouldn't have been a huge gap as there was at some point, right? So yeah, if you're learning Chinese or if you're thinking of learning Chinese, then please don't make the mistake I just made. Like, just maybe start focusing more on the speaking if that's your goal, but do not forget the characters. They are not extremely difficult. Like, it's something doable, especially if you start bit by bit and do not just leave it until the end as I was doing, or just throw the can down the road as I was doing, then I think it's going to be a way more balanced approach to learning, and that, yeah, you're not going to end up being an illiterate as I was at some point. So yeah, that was it for today. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.